Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore the history of the degrees. Now, few things in Masonic history are more perplexing than the question of how the degrees developed, and I doubt that I'm going to answer all of your questions here. This is more of an overview, getting across the idea that these things developed organically over time. Someone didn't sit down and write the entirety of them in one go. That being said, it is something worth looking at, and it is something worth putting out there because I want certain ideas to be available to you. I want you to be able to ponder these things, look into them, ask questions. Now, sometimes the most basic things are the hardest to research, as we dealt with the square. And this is one of those cases. Most know the degrees evolved, that the EA and the FC, the first two degrees, were likely a single degree at one time. And we have evidence of that it probably was. That said, there's a great deal that most do not know. For example, where did the third degree come from? Who wrote the degrees? By the way, not a question I'm going to answer here. When did they begin, and do they provide any clues about the development of Masonry? And this is one of those historical episodes. So my sources here are in large part a paper. The basis of my research is a paper by Gustafson done for Silas Shepherd Lodge in 1984 called The Development of the Three Degrees. And he gets into a lot of material about the background of various manuscripts and sources. It's a fantastic source to look at. We also have Gould and his concise history of Freemasonry. There's a little bit of Mackey. There's a little bit of this, that, and the other thing. And then I'm looking at some primary materials, such as the Regis manuscript. My goal here is to explore the issue of the degrees, their history, while accepting the muddiness and nuance inherent to any issue, which is central to so many arguments about the origin of Masonry. And we argue this all the time. Did Masons come from the Knights Templar? Did they come from something earlier? Did they develop in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries from the craft guilds? Did they develop from merchants and traders? Where did we come from? And that's one of those things as humans we really want to know, whether it's where did humanity come from or where did our fraternity come from? So let's start with some of the earliest mentions that we see in the degrees, some of the earliest source material. Leaving aside the Regis circa 1400 and Cook circa 15th century manuscripts, which describe parts of the history of the Masonic legend and the rules of conduct, we have very little early information specific to the degrees. And as an aside, you'll hear me say 1400, that's obviously a date, but when I say 15th century, that's always the 1400s, just like the 20th century was actually the 1900s. Now, the first mention tied to the degrees comes from the Harleian manuscript dated around 1650, which refers to, quote, several words and signs. Now, this may indicate that there are multiple degrees at the time with the use of the plural. And this could also mean that there are simply multiple signs to be used on different occasions. If we're coming from craft guilds, you can imagine a scenario where maybe operative Masons of different levels of operative function, in other words, the apprentice, the journeyman, the master, have different signs that they might use traveling from town to town. And let me, as an aside here, talk about that, because we talk about that Masonically, these people moving from town to town. But it doesn't make sense, because in the Gothic era, so we're around 1200, 1300, 1400 in France England, and throughout Northern Europe. The craftsmen, for the most part, don't move around that much, or you wouldn't think so, because the cathedrals are being built over generations. They're taking 100 plus years to build. So why the heck are these people moving around? The answer is these cathedrals are only being built at the times when they have money. And so they might be under construction or something's being done for 10 years. They might be doing sculptures for a period of 5 or 10 years at a crack. And then the work dries up, the budget dries up there, and they move on to the next town to do it over there. And so you would need some of these signs, especially in such an itinerant movement. We see artists like Willigemino, who is German by birth, but is itinerant. He's working in Italy and elsewhere. So same time period, same thing going on, just something to clarify. And that might explain the several words and signs. This may also mean that there's a hierarchical structure and have nothing to do with ritual. Simply, we have people at these different levels based on skill. In 1650, we haven't gotten to the first known speculative lodge yet, or speculative membership, and so that's a definite possibility. We do have evidence in the minutes of 2 Scottish lodges in 1598-99 of the possibility of 2 degrees. They mention a ceremony by which an apprentice becomes an EA, and the second for a master or fellowcraft. Now, this could be a local ritual in development, but does not give any clue to the content, which makes sense. After all, we do not outline degrees in minutes today. We don't talk about, hey, so-and-so did, all of these things, and here's the content and everything else. The ritual has always been a closely guarded secret. So, what does this mean? This means that there are at least 2 levels. It does not necessarily mean there are 2 degrees, because I'm separating ritual from hierarchy. And you have to do that. If you don't, then you very quickly come to possibly misleading conclusions. We find clues about the degrees in the Edinburgh Register House manuscript. So this is 1696. And I'm not going into detail here because they do talk about the degrees and the content of the degrees, and I'd rather not do that too much here. Although if you were to read it, the ceremonies would sound vaguely familiar. It does give guidance to the Masonic Lodge, an imitation of the Temple of Solomon, this idea of ritual being tied in. This is the first time we're really seeing any form of ritual. And what we're seeing here is a ceremony that we would recognize, a ceremony that may be 2 different degrees, but that's very difficult. If you go back and you read the Edinburgh Register House manuscript, which is available, there are PDFs of it available online, you'll see what I mean. So, 17th century, 1600s. In 1646, we have a man by the name of Ellis Ashmole, who records details of his initiation in 1646 and also of a later visit to a London lodge, but he does not provide any indication of multiple degrees. He is a diarist, and a lot of what we get from history is through personal diaries. People used to maintain them all the time. And while they were more common, having a diary that survives to this day is quite rare, which is why we use them so often as source material. Now, this is not surprising, as the degree or degrees will take time to form, and not only form, but be accepted. It does show a lack of standardization at this point, likely consistent with operative lodges, beginning to transition to speculative, and likely nullifying the Templar theory of the degrees. Why? Because if Lomas, Knight, and others are correct that the Templar degrees simply arrive in Scotland and are adopted, what would we expect to see? Well, we would expect to see a fully developed degree based on those ideas appearing in the 14th century, in the 1300s, around the time of Rosslyn Chapel and all of that. But we don't. What we see instead are differences and changes. We're not seeing 3 fully fleshed out degrees or even 1 fully fleshed out degree. And therefore, this organic development would tend to nullify, would tend to rule out the possibility of the Templars being the basis of the degree work. Instead, what we're getting is the first inkling of evolution rather than discovery. Now, I say that with great confidence and say, absolutely, this would appear to be the case. That being said, no man should ever have an idea in his head that sufficient evidence should not be able to change. And so maybe tomorrow evidence appears that suggests that no, the Knights Templar are the basis of the degrees, and if that happens, I will absolutely change my mind. And you may have different ideas, and that's fine. This is my interpretation of what I'm seeing here, and this is what history is. We find the facts, and then we interpret them. In 1686, Dr. Plott, another diarist, refers to the use of secret signs, quote, whereby they are known to one another throughout the nation. Now, these are signs of identification. In 1709, Richard Steele again mentions signs and tokens. The problem is, these are simple signs of identification more than likely. They could be tied to ritual, but it would be impossible to know from the outside. I mean, think about our signs, grips, and words, and all of that. If you don't know the ritual, it would immediately seem that these are simply forms of identification with nothing else tied to them. And there are plenty of other groups that have existed throughout time, throughout history, even today, that have various signs to know that this person, this apparent stranger, is actually a brother, is actually a member of the group. So it wouldn't be unusual. But let's look at words and grips and their evolution. Move ahead in time. And we have the Sloan manuscript. So we're in the early 18th century, the early 1700s. And this is right around the time the Grand Lodge is going to develop, 1717, the London Lodges. And in the Sloan manuscript, we do see it distinguish grips for fellowcrafts and for the master, and continues to describe a lodge of EAs and FCs as well as masters. However, it is unclear if the master here is referring to a degree or the master of the lodge. It would appear that in early lodges, the only master is the current worshipful master and any past master. In the laws and statutes of a lodge of Aberdeen in 1670, they designate two classes. Confusingly, they mention apprentices and master masons, often called fellows. So it would appear we actually have two groups. And what's happening is we have entered apprentices who come into the lodge, and then we have some kind of second degree, call it fellowcraft if you must. And from that group, we get masters, we get officers. So we have an apprentice level, but the mixing of FC and master here seems more consistent with the idea that some fellowcrafts will be elected master, perhaps taking the title of fellow among each other to distinguish past masters from other brothers, much as in Wisconsin we use the term worshipful. Calling someone worshipful doesn't mean they've gone through another degree. There is no worshipful degree. But it does show that they were, in fact, a master of the lodge. In other places, we use other terms. This does not provide enough evidence to truly distinguish a third degree. It just distinguishes the fact that there is someone in the lodge, someone who is apparently in charge of the lodge, referred to as master. And there is a history of past master degrees, and therefore there's no reason to believe that this is, in fact, what any of us would recognize as the master's degree today. So, getting into the Grand Lodge period, we're starting around 1696 through around 1740-ish, give or take. In this comparatively brief period, we go from sparse mentions of Masonry to a public and full-functioning order centered on ritual work. Of course, a specific degree for the genesis of the degrees, or a specific date for the genesis of the degrees, is difficult. But the evidence does grow quickly right around this period of 1717, this point. Now, prior to 1717, we see evidence of a single ceremony for admittance to the lodge. The formation or perhaps acceptance of the fellowcraft degree probably happens between 1719 and 1721. This very close dating of the fellowcraft degree developing right around 1717 would suggest that what we're actually dealing with is a degree that had existed, maybe informally, prior, or was in use in some form, and is now being ritualized. It's now becoming consistent. It's now being made formal. So this is a time period where we're moving from a degree that may have existed in some lodges, and it's suddenly going to be swept across the land, as it were. It is recognized by the Constitution of 1793, which describes the fellowcraft to be the highest level. So 1723, we have the fellowcraft to be the highest level, which again suggests this idea of the fellowcraft developing before that, possibly between 1719 and 21. So only 4 years earlier. And the competent to be master of the lodge or grand master. So in other words, a fellowcraft can be a master. This would indicate that in 1723, there is no master mason degree. There is no third degree. The charge at the time declares in Article 4 that the apprentice in due time will become a fellowcraft and may then arrive at the honor of being a warden and then master of the lodge, grand warden, and then grand master, possibly. The question is, was the fellowcraft used earlier? And the answer is probably in some form. That said, we probably would not recognize this proto-fellowcraft degree as it lacks Preston's lectures, which make up the middle chamber, and that have become central to that degree. So let's talk about Anderson's constitutions, because of course that plays a big role. It gives us a lot of evidence when it comes to the degrees. It's dated around 1738. And we start to see the third degree possibly being used. In it, the EA is suddenly charged. So we've changed from 1723, when we definitely have 2 degrees, to 1738, span of 15 years. The EA is charged that he may become a fellowcraft and a master mason, which means in 1738, the master mason must exist. Wardens also, according to Anderson's Constitution, must be chosen from master masons, which means it exists. So, where is it coming from? Well, the earliest mention of a third degree that we find officially is in the March 25th, 1725 minutes of Lodge Dumbarton. We see a brother Porterfield, a fellowcraft, was, quote, unanimously admitted and received a master of the fraternity and renewed his oath. The earliest reference to a master's lodge or conferral in an English lodge is found in the minutes of the Swan and Rummer Lodge in London on April 27 of 1727, where Gould tells us that 4 brothers were made Master Mason. And then it's another 2 years until we see the next Master Mason degree in the same lodge. So this is March 31 of 1729, when 6 are admitted masters at, quote, a particular lodge for passing masters. So 1727, 1729, we're seeing this idea of the Master Mason, maybe 1725. Why suddenly at this period? Well, suddenly we have, prior to that, 1721, 23, somewhere in there, so a few years prior, we've seen the fellowcraft become an acknowledged and consistent element of the ritual. And so the idea of having 2 degrees is one of those things. Humans don't like the number 2 for some things, and with something like degree work, you can imagine a scenario where someone goes, 2's good, but shouldn't we have 3? Trinities are particularly strong in education and in ritual systems, in everything from faith and religion to education. So you could imagine the idea of, hey, maybe this is something that should develop. Now, apart from what we see there in those minutes, we don't have any other known reference in minutes until 1732. The issue is there's no evidence of the content of what this conferment is, so it could be a new degree. You could argue that these are still men who are receiving a second of 2 degrees under a different name. Maybe a lodge, instead of saying fellowcrafts, is calling it masters. We don't specifically know, but we do seem to see that the 3-degree system is evolving slowly. It's slowly gathering acceptance. Often we see brothers of the period staying in the EA, or they took the EA and the FC in a single session, but we don't typically see them taking all 3 degrees. And while this is very different from what we do today, it is something that would indicate that that Master Mason degree is not regularly accepted, not used throughout. Now, I'm going to muddy the waters a bit here, because I'm going to look at some of these publications on Masonry, usually put out by Masons, former Masons, for a variety of reasons. Some of them are put out for better reasons than others. And Samuel Pritchard puts one out. Samuel Pritchard's book, 1730, called Masonry Dissected, is the most well-known book on the symbolism and catechism posting of the fraternity from the early years, and is the first such writing to claim to describe all 3 degrees. Now, this doesn't mean we have a fully fleshed out degree. It's being practiced. We know that. And given Pritchard, it's being practiced in London, in certain areas. It's probably based on earlier evidence practiced in parts of Scotland. But we could see something that's being practiced in the equivalent of 5 or 6 lodges out of all of them that exist. So it doesn't mean that it is accepted. And that's kind of what we're looking for. Does a degree exist before its acceptance? If there were an informal 4th degree today, which some lodges have done, does it get to the level of acceptance? Because if it doesn't, then it's not really a degree. So it's practiced, but we just haven't confirmed that acceptance yet. Now, by the time we jump ahead to William Preston, in 1772, he publishes Illustrations of Masonry. We're about 50 years into the 50 years into the future, which helped to standardize the ritual. His book is generally acknowledged as a source of most symbolic lodge rituals in the U.S. Webb, of course, copies much of Preston's work in his 1797 Illustrations of Masonry, with some changes for American Masonry. And Preston does address the 3rd degree. So we know by the time we get to 1772, it's accepted, it's reasonable, it's part of the work. So sometime after the Grand Lodge has formed, at the time it forms in 1717, all we can say for sure is that there is a 1st degree. There's an EA, there's a degree of acceptance or initiation. Sometime between 1719 and 1723, we see the Fellowcraft developing or being accepted, because maybe it wasn't developed at that time. It may have simply been accepted that, hey, we're going to start doing this 2nd degree. It has been in use in some lodges, and we're simply going to roll it out to everyone. Makes sense. And then sometime between 1730 and 1770, probably by 1750 or so, we see the same thing happening with the Master Mason, although it's a very different degree than the others, which is interesting. It means that it's not based off of something else. And let me point out that Preston in 1750s, 60s period, if memory serves, he is going to be removed from Masonry in the late 1760s, early 1770s for a conflict that he's having with the Grand Lodge. But prior to that, he develops what we would see as the middle chamber. And so he's going to be particularly key to part of it, but notice he's not writing an entire degree. So by the time we get to him in the 1770s, we know that there's a fully fleshed out Master Mason that we would all recognize. So let's talk about the other elephant in the room, the legend, what I'm going to refer to as the legend. If you're a Mason, you know what I'm referring to, or you will in a moment. So when we start to see the legend appearing in writing, it's only after 1730, and it did not come into ritual pre-made. It was likely the end product of several narratives that seemed to coalesce into the story of Hiram as we know it today. Bernard Jones says, quote, The legend has been classed with all the many mysteries in which a god, a superior being, or an extraordinary man suffers a death in order that he may be ushered into a more glorious existence. And it's likely derived from earlier rituals used in other places, widely diffused, which derive from the process of death and reincarnation. We see this in Christianity, of course, but it's not just Christianity. Mithraism has the idea of death and rebirth. The ancient Egyptians with Osiris, the same thing. The cult of Isis, which sounds like it's Egyptian, but it's actually more tied to the Roman army of the late empire. And others have similar ideas. While the lesson of fidelity is clear, we also see the lesson that death has no terror equal to the stain of falsehood and dishonor. So we know that the central story, the central elements are there for the Master Mason by around 1730. Is it an accepted degree? Probably not, but it's coming into use. And you could imagine a scenario where the Grand Lodge and others are sort of pushing back against this. Hey, this is the way we always did it. And it does raise several questions. I mean, you start to think about, hey, would it be possible for a hypothetical fourth degree to develop today? Would it be possible for these changes to happen today? Or is it something that has to happen at the genesis, at these key points in history? Grand Lodge first develops, the first Grand Lodge in London, and so maybe that's the key point where we can bring things like this in. So the degrees and their growth do lead the contemplative to consider the likely, very organic growth of the fraternity. It leads one to believe that the most likely origins of the fraternity are one of two. Either something where the merchant class, these sort of what would be upper middle class people today, but back in the 15th, 16th century in Northern Europe, England, etc., these people who are traders, who are trading with the East, with India and others, borrow from the operative Masons this language, these symbols, these ideas. They apply their ideas to them and create what we know as speculative Masonry. Or that comes out of the craft guilds, and slowly the craft guilds fall apart. They lose their power. They become more speculative rather than operative. And we see that slow organic growth. The Templar theory is probably ruled out if this interpretation is in fact correct and this information is in fact correct. So I'm left with far more questions, honestly, than answers. And that's kind of the key to education, going into a classroom and walking out feeling a little bit dumber than you were when you walked in, not because you didn't learn anything, but because you learned just how much you don't know about a given topic. So, for example, I'm left with questions such as, where did the degrees originate? How does that happen? How did those degrees form? Is it a group of people in a lodge that writes something and then it gets modified over time? Is it something where it starts as a very short sort of acceptance and it goes from there? A very short initiation, I mean. What stories, cultures, and legends did the authors draw from? We can always make assumptions. We can always go out there and make educated guesses about, hey, this sounds a lot like this, but it would be fantastic to find something, to find the notebook that says, here is where we drew from. This is what we were looking at. Another question I come up with is, how does a story simply start, much less a communal story with so many authors, and more importantly, with no text? And maybe that's why we see this organic development. Maybe that's why we see that development of additional degrees. Because nothing is written down, that means that at the end of the day, there is no pure work. Things can change, things can evolve. As soon as you have pure work, maybe that's the thing that stops any additional degree from happening. As soon as someone writes it down and says, this is the official work, it can no longer develop. Will the degrees change in the future? I doubt it, based on the last hypothesis that I set out, the last idea that as soon as you write it, it becomes official. But who knows? It is possible that there is somewhere in the United States a lodge that is practicing a fourth degree that in 50 years will find acceptance. But what we've done here is looked at the degrees, looked at how they may have developed, and what we see at the end of the day is a degree of initiation, which was probably the first thing. It was accepted, and early we would see a form that you would probably recognize today. We see evidence of a second degree, but maybe it comes out of a hierarchy. So, for example, you were a member for so long, or you had so many skills in the craft guild, and so that moves you up. They have their own signs, grips, and words, but they may not have their own degree until very late, until after 1717. And then that addition of a third degree by the time we hit 1730, by the time Pritchard talks about it, indicates that the Master Mason is developing. And by 1750, all three of them are accepted. Preston's writing about them in the 1770s. So we see a slow organic growth. And it really does kind of call to question what the most important parts are. Maybe what are the original parts? And by the way, the charges are generally pointed at as some of the original elements of the degrees. And maybe even the charges could be read differently. For example, a charge doesn't need a ritual. It could just be, hey, you're now a fellow craft, and so as such, you need to conduct yourself this way. The entire point of this episode is just to get you thinking. Thinking about the degrees, where they come from. Is there any evidence that might change your mind about them? And does it change your interpretation? So, my brother, thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lidke, and the rest of the Further Light team in your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.